Right. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We're so happy to be here today. And we have a class called Religious Discourse in the Public Sphere. And for those of you who don't know, we are joined by Rabba Dr. Lindsey Taylor-Guthartz. She received smichah from Yeshivat Maharat in 2021. She's currently a teaching associate at the Faculty of Divinity, Cambridge University, and has also taught at the Universities of Oxford, the School of Oriental and Asian Studies in London, King's College London, and Vassar College in the USA. In 2021, she published her first book, Challenge and Conformity: The Religious Lives of Orthodox Jewish Women, and she is currently working on a book on Limmud. Thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And it's lovely to be here. And today we're discussing a very relevant topic that's right in the center of just about all the news at the moment. And that's how to talk about difficult subjects in public. And that's a large subject. We're going to narrow our focus a little bit. And we're going to talk about our own rabbinic tradition of how to conduct religious discussion, religious discourse in the public sphere. And as you probably know, that's pretty central in the rabbinic tradition. The rabbinic tradition itself obviously was originally oral. It didn't get written down till quite a bit after the texts that we so study today actually passed from the academy into a written form. And even in its modern form, rabbinic tradition does preserve a lot of characteristics of people actually arguing with each other. If you've ever been to a traditional yeshiva or participated in that style of learning, you'll know that argumentation is still very live in Judaism. And the basic concept that the rabbis use to talk about this is that of machloket. And you can translate machloket in different ways: dispute, division, controversy, disagreement, all those. And it comes from a root that means to divide. So essentially, the idea, it's a matter in which there is a division of opinion into different groups. So it doesn't necessarily mean something negative. Machloket can be quite a wide-ranging word. And it's pretty obvious that when you're discussing something or disputing it, people will have different opinions on important matters, and they'll want to express and discuss those opinions in public. So the rabbinic focus is much more on the motivations that underlie machloket and the manner in which machloket is handled. And we're going to focus on those two aspects: motivations and manner. Both of those in turn determine whether a particular example of machloket is considered to be positive or negative, and you can have both types. And for our classical rabbis, for Chazal, the type story in the Torah is about machloket is the episode of the rebellion of Korach, which appears in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers. And we'll just have a quick revise of what that is and then start looking at some texts to illustrate this rabbinic idea, even though we're starting with the biblical version of it. So Korach in the Bible is a Levite. He's a cousin of Moses. And along with three other named individuals and an unnamed group of about 250 Israelite leaders, he confronts Moses and Aaron with a demand, shall we say. We're going to look at the biblical tradition here. They, Korah and his mates, assembled against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far." In the original Hebrew, that's Rav Lachem, too much for you. You've done too much. All the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. So why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of God? And right away we can see that this is quite a personal attack. It's against Moses and against Aaron specifically. And what they're saying is, we are bringing this issue because of equality and fairness. You are ignoring the rest of the congregation. So that's the way it's working out. So understandably, Moses is quite appalled by this attack. And he orders Korach and his friends to come back the next day and offer incense as a test, so that God can demonstrate in public who are God's appointed leaders and who aren't. And he also points out, quite subtly, the unseemly ambition behind Korach's rebellion. So this is our next bit of the biblical passage. Then Moses said to Korach, "Hear now, you Levites," that's what they are, "is it too little for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to allow you to approach him in order to perform the duties of the Lord's tabernacle, the Mishkan, and to stand before the congregation and serve them? He has allowed you to approach him and all your brother Levites with you, yet you seek the priesthood as well. You want to be Kohanim. Therefore, you and all your company have gathered together against the Lord. What is Aaron that you rail against him?" And Moses' response picks out the problems with Korach's attack. You are having a go at Aaron. He's done nothing to you. And then he shows the hypocrisy of Korach. Korach is already a Levite. The Levites are already a separate caste, if you like, a separate group from the rest of the congregation. So why is Korach saying, all the congregation are holy, every one of them? He's not saying, oh, everybody is the same as the Levites. He's just saying, I want what you've got. I want the priesthood which Aaron and his sons have. So by saying, "Here now, you Levites," Moses is showing up this hypocrisy. We don't hear Korach proposing to extend Levite status to everybody else. So we could, the rest of the story is quite grim. The next day, Korach and his friends turn up at the tent of meeting. God's glory appears, and God commands the rest of the Israelites to move away from Korach and his followers, and they are then swallowed up by the earth. And the 250 Israelites who had gone along with him are consumed by fire. So it's a pretty nasty ending. Now, we could analyze the biblical story in its own right, but what I'm interested in here is how the rabbis made use of this story. We've seen a little bit of what it looks like. We've seen the issues that come up here. And you can understand that in this way, the rabbis see it very much about motivation. We've talked about Korach's selfishness, his ambition, the fact that he wants a status he's not granted, and that he uses hypocritical arguments. We're all equal, even though he's already got a status higher than most of the Israelites among them. So this idea of motivation and impure motives very much resonates with the rabbis. And we see this in the way that the rabbis understand how they actually how should we say how this story functions. And if we go down to this rabbinic text from the Mishnah, from Pirkei Avot, we have a pronouncement, if you like. Every machloket, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. And then they feel they need to give examples. Which is the machloket that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the machloket of Hillel and Shammai. First century rabbis, will come back to them in a moment. And which is the machloket that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the machloket of Korach and all his congregation. So when I say that the rabbis see this as the type story, this is their best ever example of a bad machloket, a negative machloket. For the rabbis, whose ideal was the constant study and discussion of the Torah, the archetype of a good machloket, a positive machloket, is a series of disagreements on matters of Jewish law between the early first century rabbis Hillel and Shammai, and the houses, the schools, if you like, that they follow also. These disputes are earnest discussions about how to fulfill God's will. The stakes are, that's quite a high stake, how do you actually live according to the way that God wants you to, as expressed in the Torah? So if they don't agree about how to do that, their aim is shared. Their aim is very much, let's serve God, let's live the correct way, let's find out the best of doing this. So they have an ultimate praiseworthy aim. It is for the sake of heaven. And in contrast, the rabbis look at Korach and they go, no, Korach was asking nasty questions to discomfort Moshe. It's a personal attack. He's hypocritical. And Other midrashic texts from the rabbis also point out or imagine what sort of things Korach was saying. We're going to go back to one from Midrash Tanhuma. And they imagine Korach as coming up with specious questions of halakha, just designed to embarrass Moshe. So we'll look at one example from Midrash Tanhuma. Korach, the Hebrew says, kafas, he jumped at his chance, and he said to Moses, Moshe, the Torah says, you shall put a tzitzit on the corner of your garments. Doesn't quote the verse in full. One of the elements is you put a thread of blue, of techelet, on that tzitzit, on that little fringe. So Korach asked, what about a talit that is entirely blue, entirely techelet? Is it exempt from tzitzit? And Moshe said, no, it requires tzitzit. Even if it's completely techelet in color, it still needs the fringes with their little thread of blue. Korach says to him, one has to imagine a triumphant, sarcastic tone. An entirely blue talit doesn't exempt itself, but 4 little blue threads exempt it? Now, this would be ridiculous. So he's mocking Moshe, he's mocking the halakha, no worse sin in the eyes of the rabbis. And the texts, the rabbinic texts, come up with other examples of Korach's sort of nasty halachic questions that are designed to make Moshe look foolish. So again, we have a nasty motivation, we have the humiliation of other people in public, or Korach's intention to humiliate Moshe in public, which, as we know, is a big sin in rabbinic terms. They liken embarrassing other people in public to murdering them. So he's painted in very, very dark colours in the Midrashic imagination. And here we see the prime example of the difference in motivation. So we said there are two main elements for the rabbis to distinguishing good dispute from bad dispute, good machloket from bad machloket, and they are motivation and manners. If you're going to have a good machloket, it's got to be pure, it's got to reflect the search to do God's will, and there mustn't be any personal spite or humiliating of your opponents in it. So far, so good. Other rabbinic sources approach the question of dispute, of machloket, and the reconciliation of the two sides from a different angle. And in another text, this time from the Talmud, we can see this question of the good machloket, the one between Hillel and Shammai, between their followers, how that actually works out in practice. So we've got the same example. We had this before in Pirkei Avot. This is the prime example for the sake of heaven, the machloket of Hillel and Shammai, and here we have an exploration. And this is from the tractate Eruvin of the Babylonian Talmud. What does do the Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel disagreed on halachic matters. These said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion, and these said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice, a Vassar emerged and proclaimed, both these and these are the words of the living God. However, the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of the house of Hillel. At this point, we have a later comment that's been incorporated into this text. So it's a later layer, it's the anonymous voice of the Talmud. Since both these and those are the words of the living God, why were the house of Hillel privileged to have the halakha established in accordance with their opinion? Because they were gracious, modest, and they would teach both their own statements and the statements of the house of Shammai. Moreover, when they formulated their teachings, they repeated the statements of the house of Shammai before their own statements. So here we have the way in which you perform a dispute. Clearly, both sides here have got the highest motivation, very God-centered. But that's not enough. The practical demands of everyday life, including what we do in particular ritual actions, mean that we've got to come down on one side or the other. We have to have a conclusion. Even though the divine voice says both these are the words of the living God, they're equally valid interpretations of the Torah and the eyes of God, even the Vassar recognizes in human life there's got to be a decision one way or the other, and God has apparently decided that's going to be the opinions of the house of Hillel. And here the later layer of commentary picks up the obvious question and is curious. Why come down on the side of the house of Hillel? Surely absolute truth from God's viewpoint would mean that one side is correct. And surely that might sometimes be according to the house of Hillel, Other times it might be according to the house of Shammai. Instead of coming on down on both sides or taking it out issue by issue, we've got this decision that it's going to be the house of heaven. And that needs explanation. So it seems to be dependent on other considerations than absolute truth. It's not just that their opinions are correct. The decisive factor here seems to be nice social behavior. The House of Hillel is going to have the privilege of having its opinions seen as the final opinions or the correct opinions, not because they're actually correct necessarily, but because they do machlokit well. They perform dispute in a good way. They act politely, respectfully, they act with moderation and courtesy, and they put the opinions of their opponents and actually present them before their own opinions. So those are good models to follow. So these are really impressive and aspirational standards for how to conduct public debate. And we can, in Jewish history, find actual examples of people following these principles. And we'll have a little look at one. So we'll look at one from the 17th, 18th century. There was a rabbi called Rabbi David Halevi Segal, who was born in the 16th century, died in 1667, and he published a well-known commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, one of the prime codes of Jewish law. And his commentary was called the Turei Zahav, the Pillars of God. And the first letters of Turei Zahav furnished a nickname for this rabbi. It's known as the Taz, the T from Turei, and the Z from Zahav, or Z, I should be saying, for American listeners. The same year that he published his commentary, a much, much younger scholar, Rabbi Shabtai HaKohen, who was born in 1621, about almost 50 years later than Rabbi David Halevi Segal, wrote his own commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. And he called that the Siftei Kohen, which in turn led to his nickname, the Shach, for the sin of Siftei and the Kaf of Kohen. And he disagreed in many respects from the first rabbi, the Taz. He also wrote a whole work refuting a lot of the Taz's decisions, which was called the Nukudot HaKesef. And the Taz in his turn wrote a book responding to that. However, in the introduction to his book, which basically took issue with a lot of things that the Taz had said, he was very careful to introduce this paragraph. So, Rabbi Shabtai HaKohen said, "Let the reader of this book not imagine that because, God forbid, I had a machloket to dispute with the author of the Turei Zahav, or that because I harbored a grudge against him in my heart, I wrote my refutations of his book. For behold, it is known to all that we are friends in dispute. But the Torah seeks its accustomed home," this is a rabbinic saying, "and I had the honor to provide a home for the author of the Turei Zahav when he stayed with me for 3 days. I accorded him tremendous honor, which beggars all description, and he honored me greatly, kissing me on the head and rejoicing over me as on Simchat Bet HaShoeva, festival that was held in Temperance. And God Almighty knows this, that I composed this book, Nukudot HaKesef, purely for the sake of heaven." And you can hear how Rabbi Shabtai HaKohen is very concerned about this issue of machloket. He's disagreeing with an older scholar, a very famous scholar, but he's not doing it to be spiteful, he's not doing it because he has a grudge. He is doing it for the sake of heaven. He's going back to that what text that says good machloket is for the sake of heaven. And he places a huge emphasis on the honor he gave to the Taz, who came to stay with him for 3 days, and on the honor Taz gave to him. So there is a really good example about how these principles of the correct way to carry a machloket could be carried out. However, I have to tell you this didn't always happen. And we have a talmudic text, actually, that shows it didn't always happen. The text in Eruvin about how the House of Hillel were privileged to have their decisions recognized as the final ones because they were so nice to their opponents, has a counterpart. And it has a counterpart in more than one text, because several Talmudic texts actually record that rabbinic culture was quite violent when it came to dispute. The scholar Jeffrey Rubenstein has written on this. And metaphors of war and fighting are often used in these descriptions of rabbinic argumentation. You can have a look one from Tractate Sanhedrin. Rabbi Oshaya said, What is the meaning of the verse from Zechariah, one of the books of the Bible? I got two stars, one of which I named Noah, grace, and the other I named Kobli, damages. Okay, let's take it one by one. Grace. These are the scholars of the land of Israel who were gracious, manimim, same root as Noam, to each other in halachic debate. What about the second one? Damages. These are the scholars in Babylonia who damaged mechablin, the word chaval, each other in halachic debate. So apparently there was a difference in rabbinic culture. The scholars of the land of Israel were quite nice to each other, but the scholars of Babylon were famous for being antagonistic and quite violent in debate. And we have other passages like this that explicitly compare the scholarly debates of the rabbis of Babylon to war and armed struggle. And it seems to indicate that in real life, machloket wasn't always conducted peaceably, even if it was for the sake of heaven. And in addition, it was very much bound up with issues of honor and shame, which were very, very important to scholars of the Talmudic period. And there's a very, very famous story in the Babylonian Talmud, which you may know, known as the story of the oven of Achnai, and it bears a very close similarity to the Eruvin text about the house of Hillel and Shammai, but it's got a very different ending, and I'd like to look at that one too. We won't read all of it because it's long, but we'll read the important bit. So it comes from the Tractate Rabba Metzia, and it starts off with Rabbi Eliezer, who is opposed to every other single rabbi on a very abstruse point of halacha, point of law. He performs 3 miracles to support his opinion, but the other rabbis are completely unimpressed and say, you're wrong. Eventually, a divine voice, a bat kol, who we saw in the other story, appears and confirms that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is correct in every case. A little bit different from the version in Eruvin, where both the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai were correct. Here it says, no, Rabbi Eliezer is very, very correct, and that's it. And here the difference is, at this point, Rabbi Yehoshua stood up on his feet and said, it is not in heaven, lo b'shamayim, which is a quote from Dvarim in the Torah. The Talmud asked, what do you mean? What is it's not in heaven? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, we don't listen to a divine voice in matters of halacha, since you, God, already gave the Torah to us on Mount Sinai, and it's written there, go with the majority. It says so in the book of Shemot. What do we need divine voices for? And that apparently ended the matter with the rabbis. And then there's some sequels. Later on, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when he heard the rabbi saying this? Elijah said to him, he smiled, and he said, my children have triumphed over me. Children have triumphed over me. In other words, God conceded defeat and said to the rabbi, it's fine if you want to privilege your decisions over my decisions, fine. I've given you the Torah. You're right. It's not in heaven anymore. I've given it to you to play with, and you can make your mind. So that's usually as far as most versions of the story go. And if you've heard the story before, that might be the limit at which you know that it has a dark ending. At that time, the sages brought all the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had declared pure, and they burned them, and they voted and they banned him. They put him under a cherem, so nobody could talk to him or approach him or give him food or anything. And they said, who will go and inform him of the ban? Rabbi Akiva said to them, I will go. Let the wrong person go. Rabbi Eliezer would thereby destroy the entire world. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He dressed in black and he sat 4 cubits away, that's 4 arm lengths away from Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, why is this day different? You're behaving in an unusual way. He said to him, my master, it seems to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. It was a very polite way of saying they put you under a ban. Rabbi Eliezer tore his garments and took off his shoes and slipped off his suit and sat on the ground. In other words, he is mourning. He's mourning this lost status. He wept, and the world was afflicted. 1/3 of the olive crop and 1/3 of the wheat and 1/3 of the barley were destroyed. And some say even the dough being kneaded by woman was spoiled. In other words, not just plants that are still rooted in the natural environment, but even harvested plants that have been processed by people, they were affected too. And they taught the destruction reaped by Rabbi Eliezer was so great on this day that every place where Rabbi Eliezer cast his eyes immediately was burned. At that time, Rabbi Gamliel, who was the head of the rabbinic assembly, was on the ship. A wave of the sea came to drown him. He said, It seems to me that this is because of Rabbi Eliezer. He stood up on his feet and he said, Master of the universe, I acted not for my honor, nor did I act for the honor of my father's house, but I acted for your honor in order that machloket not multiply in Israel. In other words, my motivations are for the sake of heaven. The sea immediately rested from its lead. This is a very dark story. The rabbis, led by Rabbi Yehoshua, insist that authority lies with the rabbis themselves, according to the Torah itself, and God has no further voice in deciding Jewish law, since we have a principle in the Torah of majority opinion wins, and apparently God accepts that. However, by adhering to this legal procedure, they have wounded poor Rabbi Eliezer to the core, and they make it much worse by imposing a ban on him. And in his shame and his pain, he becomes a source of destruction, and everything he looks at is reduced to cinders. The head of the rabbinic assembly, Rabbi Gamliel, is almost drowned by the power that's unleashed by Rabbi Eliezer's shame and humiliation. And in fact, later on, there's a bit more of this story, he does die as a result of Rabbi Eliezer's shame. It's clear that the rabbis were really aware of the strong feelings and the negative effects of impassioned public debate. And in this context, the earlier text we looked at, the one from Eruvin about the lovely behavior of the House of Hillel, doesn't really reflect this. It's perhaps a counterpart. It's an alternative. It's a vision of what public debate should be, involving proper consideration of the feelings and the honor and the reaction of the losing side in order to prevent this leading to social destruction. The conclusion reached in rabbinic culture seems to be that it's not enough to follow correct legal procedure, not even, as Rabbi Gamliel claims, in order to act to reduce debate and disagreement. But it seems that we have to find a way that we can have public machloket, but also diffuse its negative effects in society. Argument and debate never exist in a vacuum, we know that all too well. But in a social context in which people who participate are just as important as the principles and issues that they are debating. And it seems that rabbis really cared about that too. So I would like to leave things there with the wisdom and the sensitivity of the rabbis in recognizing the harmfulness of violent and corrosive debate, with their emphasis on treating those with whom we disagree with courtesy and respect. But unfortunately, that is not the complete picture. The rules of civilized discourse did apply when the rabbis could categorize a dispute as being for the sake of heaven. But if they felt that a dispute did not come into that category, they had no hesitation at all in using very violent and inflammatory words to attack their opponents. And I have to say, this is a characteristic of rabbinic discourse down the centuries to the modern day. It wasn't just Korach who made them angry. We can see much more recent examples. Let's go back to the 18th century and have a look at one. Very famous Rabbi Jacob Emden, who died in 1776, so it's his 250th anniversary, as well as the 250th anniversary of other important things happening this year. He was the sworn enemy of the Shabbatean heresy, which had swept through the Jewish world in the 17th century and was still continuing. And in his attempts to discredit Shabbateans or undercover Shabbateans, he spoke of them as less than Hebrew in quite a shocking way. And here's a little bit from his book, Sefer Shimosh. He says, how can you compare Christians to these heretics, the Shabbatites, the obstacles and thorns in the flesh? May their names rot. In my eyes, they're like beasts of the forest. And even this comparison is not completely correct, because even beasts of prey don't cleave any more to those who are not of their kind, as they did in the generation of the flood. These abominations, the heretics who follow Shabbatites' theme, don't recognize their own seed, and there's no need to say they are worse than any humans, whoever they are. Well, that's not exactly peaceful and courteous respect for your enemy's opinions. You could possibly say, well, they were heretics. Any language is justified. You can say what you like about people who are outside our circle, who are just not part of our discourse at all. Maybe they couldn't ever be defined as people who are running a discourse for the sake of heaven. Maybe it doesn't matter what you say to them. But quite honestly, again, if we look at history, we can see that people didn't have to be that separate. They didn't have to be heretics. They didn't have to be totally outside the Jewish community to incite some very, very violent words. We could take another example. In the late 18th century, when the very early Maskilim, the Enlighteners, who at this stage were all very pious and observant Jews, when they put forward proposals to add some secular subjects to traditional Jewish schools, such as the study of the local languages, and the study of history, geography, and astronomy. Some traditionalist rabbis characterized them as wicked and sinful and absolutely outside the charmed circle of respectful discourse. One of the great opponents of the early masculine was Rabbi David Heveler of Lissa, and he turned against somebody who'd actually been a protege of his, another scholar called Naftali Herz Vesely, who died in 1805. He was a scholar who had published a book called Divrei Shalom Ve'emet that advocated reforms to Jewish education. And he published this in 1782. And even though Rabbi Tevele had previously approved another book by Vesely, he felt no compunction at all in saying some horrible things about him, and here they are. In fact, he preached a sermon against him. My heart skips many beats when I contemplate the audacity of this evil man. Aside from the fundamentals of the Hebrew language and a simple rudimentary knowledge of scripture and the commentaries, this man is bereft of the sublime wisdom of the Torah. How can one who does not possess any of the foundations of knowledge presume to teach the correct manner of study, proper conduct, and the way of God to the people of God? Can one who is weak claim he is strong? Beware, this man Vesely is an impious man. Beware, do not draw near to him. In my perusal of his small book, I have noted that the spirit of sin animates it. This book seeks to lead the masses astray and to mislead children just out of the womb so that they will not know the paths of Torah and piety. Vesely's counsel is that of a renegade. These are very, very strong words for somebody who he must have known was actually an accomplished scholar. Really, really nasty. And he imputes the nastiest motives for him that he's trying to mislead children. He's trying to lead the masses astray. Vesely had actually taken part in Moses Mendelssohn's great project of producing a German translation of the Torah and also producing a Hebrew commentary to go with it. And he'd actually written the Hebrew commentary on Vayikra as part of that project. And he was an accomplished scholar, but Rabbi Tevele felt no compunction at all in insulting and denigrating him and imputing anti-religious motives to him. And I'm sad to say that we can actually find lots of those examples down to the present day. So we are left with a bit of a problem. Though the rabbis did undoubtedly recognize the dangers of violent and aggressive dispute many centuries ago, and they outlined their expectations of how public debate should be carried on, how machloket should be performed, rabbinic culture from then to now did tend to draw a circle around those disputants who were part of things, who were members of mainstream Jewish society, and to exclude certain groups as those whose motives were not for the sake of heaven, and who therefore weren't included in the expectations of respectful debate. The urgent question now becomes, who is entitled to be counted as within that circle of machloket l'shem shamayim? Can we extend that circle? Should we extend that circle? Are there some people who should be permanently excluded and who don't have to be treated with respect? I don't have a neat answer to this, I'm afraid to say, but I would like to end with thinking about an interesting example, again from rabbinic literature, about somebody who excluded himself from the charmed circle, but who was still treated with consideration, with respect. So he was still inside. And the example is the first century sage Elisha ben Abuya, also known as Acher, the other, who, according to one story in the Talmud, lost his faith in God after witnessing the death of a child who fell from a tree while collecting birds' eggs at his father's request. Why those particular things? Because that involves two commandments. The child's action involved the sending the mother bird away before collecting the eggs, and honoring his father. And both those commandments in the Torah are accompanied by the promise that somebody who observes those commandments will have long life. So the irony and the inexplicability of a child who performs both these long life commandments and then dies was too much for Elisha ben Abuya. He apparently lost his faith. So the Jerusalem Talmud has a very poignant story about his meeting with his former pupil, Rabbi Meir. We'll read that. Rabbi Meir was sitting and expounding in the house of study of Tiberius when his teacher Elisha ben Nebuah passed by, riding on a horse on Shabbat. They came and told him, "Your teacher is outside." And he stopped his drasha, his explanation, and he went out to him. Elisha asked Rabbi Meir, "What were you expounding today?" And he told him, "And the Lord blessed the end of Eov more than his beginning," a biblical verse in the book of Job, the book of Eov. Elisha asked Rabbi Meir, "What did you expound on?" And Rabbi Meir answered him, "And the Lord added double all that Eov had owned." In other words, at the end of the story, he doubled the money that he had lost at the beginning of the story. Elisha said, "Woe to those who are lost and not found." Does he mean himself? It's not clear. Your teacher Akiva would not have expanded this, but he would rather have said, "The Lord blessed the end of Eov more than his beginning," in the Hebrew it's merishitav, which can also mean from his beginning. He blessed him by the merit of the mitzvot, the commandments, and the good works which were in his hand from the beginning. So it's an alternative, more nuanced, more positive, perhaps, explanation of the same verse that Rabbi Meir has been trying to explain. And the Talmudic passage goes on to give two more examples of these verses, which I've skipped out here. Elisha said to him, "This is enough, Meir. Up to here is the limit of the Shabbat domain." In other words, where we've got to is the end of the 2,000 cubits, which you can walk on Shabbat. After that, you will be breaking Shabbat if you pass this. It's called the Shabbat Tzachum, the Shabbat limit or domain. Rabbi Meir asked him, "How do you know?" Elisha told him, "From the horse's hooves, which I counted for 2,000 cubits." While they're talking, he's apparently been recording in his mind how far they are. Rabbi Meir said to him, "All that wisdom is in you. If you do not repent, please come back to us." Elisha told him, "I cannot." He asked him why. Elisha told him, "Once I was passing by the Holy of Holies, riding on a horse in Yom Kippur, which fell on a Shabbat, all bad things you could do together. And I heard a bat call, again, that voice, divine voice, coming from the Holy of Holies, saying, 'Return, sinful children,' except for Elisha ben Nebuah, who knew my power and rebelled against me." This is a very, very sad story. And even though Elisha ben Nebuah has left the Jewish community, he's put himself outside that charm circle, Rabbi Meir interrupts his own Torah teaching to go and talk to him, and apparently follows him along as he is desecrating Shabbat by riding a horse. And as they go, Elisha asks what he has been expounding, what he's been teaching, which is a very common question in rabbinic conversations in the Talmud. And there follows a series of exchanges where Rabbi Meir tells Elisha which verse he's been teaching and how he's explained it. And Elisha remarks that Rabbi Meir's teacher, Rabbi Akiva, would have done a much better job and given a much better explanation. So thus he's continuing to teach Rabbi Meir Torah, even though he no longer believes in Torah. Eventually, they get to the end of the Shabbat domain, the 2,000 cubit limit, and rather unexpectedly, Elisha points out to Rabbi Meir that he's got that far to stop him desecrating Shabbat, even though Elisha himself doesn't care about Shabbat anymore. Rabbi Meir then makes an appeal to Elisha to repent, to come back into the community, to give them back all this wisdom he's accumulated. But Elisha asserts that God won't let him do so. But what stands out for me is the fact that Rabbi Meir still wanted to learn from Elisha and to discuss Torah with him, in spite of the fact that such learning could not be the Shem Shemai, couldn't be for the sake of heaven, because Elisha doesn't recognize the power of heaven, the power of God anymore. But he's still willing to debate with him. He's eager to debate with him. He's respectful of him. And he still clearly loves him and misses him and would like him to repent and come back. And Elisha, though he clearly is not keeping Shabbat anymore, doesn't believe in the Torah anymore, he knows that Shabbat is important to Rabbi Meir. And so he warns him before Rabbi Meir can break a Shabbat by crossing the boundary. They exhibit mutual respect, and they still manage to talk to each other, in spite of their unbridgeable and permanent differences. And I think that this is a really good story to ponder when we are thinking about that very difficult question of whom we are willing to talk with, how we'll conduct those debates. It's always easy to conduct polite and respectful debates with people who are within your circle, who largely agree with you, who agree on the main things, the big picture, the existence of heaven, the existence of a common moral framework. The real question is not how do we conduct debates with those people, because that is not very hard. The real question is, how do we conduct our debates with people outside the charm circle, people with whom we don't agree, people who we don't share a moral framework with? Can we do that? Perhaps the way in which we can behave, in which we can conduct those debates, will ensure that somehow, even when it is extremely, extremely difficult, we can still make machloket, make dispute, something that is for the sake of heaven, Shem Shamayim. So, I'm afraid not an answer, more of a challenge, possibly, or a thought. And if anyone would like to ask any questions or have any points clarified, I'm very, very happy to do my best to answer those points. If anyone's got any questions.
Thank you. I'll check the live stream on Facebook, and anyone who would like to ask a question can put it in the chat or feel free to just unmute. Let me see here. No questions in Facebook. Do we have anything here?
No questions in the chat. Yep. Obviously, I've explained it all perfectly.
Exactly.
I think it is an open debate, though. I think it's a debate that we need to have, not so much how to conduct dispute as who we include and who we exclude, and how we can include more people. Because, yeah, you know, the more people we exclude, the less we're going to have any respectful and respectable dispute or discourse at all. And if we're always talking inside the echo chamber, well, that's no biggie. The difficulty is managing to bridge that gap and maybe transferring our rules of engagement to that wider audience, that wider not echo chamber, the big, difficult, dangerous world out there. And that's the real challenge, and that's, I think, what we should be thinking about. So,
thank you so much, Rabba Lindsey. It was great to learn from you today. And thank you for everyone who joined us here today. I just wanted to quickly remind everyone our next class is going to be Tuesday, August 18th. It's actually going to be an interview with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg about his new book set, and that will be followed a couple hours later by a class with Rabbinic Dr. Agnes Augie Vito. And so we hope you'll sign up and join us for those. But with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Do go to both. They're both fabulous teachers.
Oh, there you have it, folks. All right. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.